They mocked a crippled boy in the saloon. 1 hour later, 50 cowboys rode in and shut them down. The autumn sun hung low over Clearwater, Texas, casting long shadows through the dusty streets as another scorching day slowly surrendered to the cool embrace of evening. The year was 1882, and the frontier town buzzed with the familiar sounds of cowboys finishing their work, horses neighing in the distance, and the clinking of spurs against weathered wooden sidewalks. Inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of whiskey. Piano music tinkled from the corner where old Pete hammered out familiar tunes on his battered upright, while card games unfolded at several tables scattered throughout the dimly lit establishment. The saloon served as the heart of Clearwater's social life, where ranchers, drifters, and townspeople gathered each evening to wash away the day's troubles with amber liquid and boisterous conversation. At the far end of the bar stood Samuel Sam Wellington, a 22-year-old man whose presence commanded attention for all the wrong reasons. His left leg, weakened by a childhood bout with polio, forced him to rely on a carved wooden cane that had become as much a part of him as his sandy brown hair and piercing blue eyes. Despite his disability, Sam possessed a quiet dignity and intelligence that shone through his weathered work clothes and dust-covered boots. Sam had ridden into town that afternoon from the sprawling Wellington Ranch, 15 miles north of Clearwater. He'd come seeking supplies and perhaps a moment of respite from the isolation of ranch life, though he should have known better than to expect peace in a place where whiskey loosened tongues and revealed the worst in men's souls. Well, look what the wind blew in," sneered Jake Morrison, a burly cattle rustler with a reputation for cruelty that extended far beyond his treatment of livestock. His voice carried across the saloon like the rattle of a snake, immediately drawing the attention of his companions and several other patrons. Morrison had been drinking since noon, and the alcohol had stripped away whatever thin veneer of civility he might have possessed. Beside Morrison stood his two constant companions. Snake Eyes, Rodriguez, a lean man with cold black eyes and a knife scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, and Tommy the Weasel Sullivan, a nervous, twitchy individual whose loyalty to Morrison stemmed more from fear than friendship. The three men had been causing trouble in various frontier towns for months, always managing to stay one step ahead of the law through a combination of cunning and ruthless intimidation. Sam ignored the comment and continued nursing his beer, hoping that silence might discourage further attention. He'd learned long ago that engaging with men like Morrison only invited more trouble, and he had no desire to create a scene in front of the other patrons. The saloon held perhaps 30 people that evening, a mix of local ranchers, traveling merchants, and working men who simply wanted to enjoy their drinks in peace. "I'm talking to you, cripple." Morrison's voice grew louder, more insistent. He took a step closer to Sam, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. The piano music faltered as old Pete sensed the tension building, and conversations at nearby tables began to die down as people turned to watch the unfolding confrontation. Sam slowly turned his head toward Morrison, his jaw set in a firm line. "I heard you," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the situation. "I just don't see any reason to respond to a man who's too drunk to remember his manners." The response drew a few chuckles from other patrons, which only served to inflame Morrison's anger. His face flushed red beneath his stubbled cheeks, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Snake Eyes and Tommy flanked him, creating a triangle of hostility that seemed to press in on Sam from all sides. "Manners?" Morrison barked, loud enough to ensure everyone in the saloon could hear. "You want to talk about manners when you're standing there like some kind of broken-down horse that should have been put out of its misery years ago?" The cruelty in his words cut through the smoky air like a blade, and even the most hardened men in the room shifted uncomfortably at the unnecessary viciousness. Sam's knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on his cane, but he maintained his composure. He'd endured worse taunts in his 22 years, though never from men quite so dangerous as these three. "I reckon a man's worth isn't measured by how his legs work," he replied evenly, "but by how he treats others when he thinks nobody important is watching." The words hung in the air like gun smoke, and for a moment, it seemed as though Morrison might let the matter drop. But Snake Eyes whispered something in his ear, and whatever he said ignited a fresh wave of malicious glee in the rustler's eyes. "Boys," Morrison announced to his companions while keeping his gaze fixed on Sam, "looks like we got ourselves a philosopher here. Maybe we should help him understand what happens when cripples try to act smart around their betters." The threat was unmistakable, and Sam felt his heart rate increase as he assessed his options. The saloon had grown eerily quiet, with even old Pete abandoning his piano bench to watch the confrontation unfold. Sam noticed that while many patrons looked uncomfortable with Morrison's behavior, none seemed willing to intervene on behalf of a stranger, especially one they might view as an easy target. "I don't want any trouble," Sam said, setting his beer glass carefully on the bar and shifting his weight to better accommodate his cane. "I'll finish my drink and be on my way." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, Gimp," Morrison said, the cruel nickname dripping from his lips like poison. "See, your very presence here troubles me. Makes the place look bad, having broken goods cluttering up the scenery." Tommy, the weasel, giggled nervously at his boss's words, while Snake Eyes remained silent but watchful, his hand resting casually near the knife on his belt. The three men had clearly done this before, working together to intimidate and humiliate their chosen targets, while ensuring that any potential heroes thought twice before getting involved. Sam straightened his shoulders, drawing himself up to his full height despite his weakened leg. At 6 feet tall, he wasn't a small man, and years of ranch work had given him considerable strength in his arms and shoulders. But he was 1 against 3, and he knew that his disability would make any physical confrontation extremely dangerous. "I'm not looking for a fight," Sam repeated, his voice carrying a note of warning despite his precarious situation. "But I won't be run out of a public establishment by men too cowardly to pick on someone their own size." The insult struck home, and Morrison's face darkened with rage. He took another step forward, now close enough that Sam could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the malice burning in his bloodshot eyes. The confrontation had reached a tipping point, and everyone in the saloon seemed to sense that violence was only moments away. "Cowardly?" Morrison repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "Did this broken-down excuse for a man just call me a coward?" He looked around the room theatrically, seeking confirmation from the other patrons who watched in uncomfortable silence. What Morrison didn't notice, and what Sam couldn't see from his position at the bar, was the slight figure of a young woman who had entered the saloon through the back entrance during the confrontation. She stood in the shadows near the rear door, her presence undetected by the drunk bullies who were too focused on their victim to notice they had acquired an audience member whose opinion would matter far more than they could possibly imagine. The woman was Elizabeth Beth Wellington, Sam's younger sister, who had ridden into town that evening on an errand of her own. At 19, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that turned heads wherever she went. With dark auburn hair that caught the lamplight and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. But more than her beauty, Beth possessed a fierce intelligence and an unshakable loyalty to her family that made her a formidable opponent when aroused to anger. As Morrison continued his verbal assault on her brother, Beth's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and her jaw set in a line that anyone familiar with the Wellington family would have recognized as a dangerous sign. She had inherited more than just her father's green eyes. She had also inherited his legendary temper, and his absolute refusal to allow anyone to threaten or humiliate a member of his family. "I think," Morrison continued, his voice growing more theatrical by the moment, "that this cripple needs to learn some respect. Maybe a few bruises will help him remember his place in the world." Snake Eyes cracked his knuckles meaningfully, while Tommy continued his nervous giggling, clearly excited by the prospect of violence against someone who couldn't effectively fight back. The three men began to close in on Sam, who shifted his grip on his cane and prepared to defend himself as best he could. It was at that moment that Beth stepped out of the shadows, her voice cutting through the tension like a church bell on a quiet Sunday morning. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone deceptively calm and polite, "I believe you're making a terrible mistake." The three men spun around in surprise, not having noticed her entrance. Morrison's eyes widened as he took in her beauty, and his expression shifted from anger to predatory interest in the span of a heartbeat. Snake Eyes and Tommy flanked their leader, suddenly uncertain how to proceed now that an attractive woman had entered the situation. "Well, well," Morrison said, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a charming tone. "Looks like the evening just got a lot more interesting. Don't you worry, pretty lady, we're just having a little conversation with this cripple here. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." Beth walked further into the light, and Sam's heart nearly stopped as he recognized his sister. He opened his mouth to warn her away, knowing that her presence would only complicate an already dangerous situation, but Beth silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. "The man you're harassing," she said, her voice still calm but with an undertone that made the hair on the back of neck stand up, "is my brother, and I'm afraid I can't allow you to continue this conversation." The revelation sent a ripple of surprise through the saloon. Morrison's expression shifted again, this time to confused anger as he tried to process this new information. How could such a beautiful woman be related to the cripple they'd been tormenting? "Your brother?" Morrison said slowly, looking back and forth between Sam and Beth as if trying to spot a family resemblance. "Well, ain't that something? Seems like good looks run in your family, but I reckon they forgot to include working legs in the package for him." The cruel comment drew a few uncomfortable chuckles from some of the other patrons, but Beth's expression remained perfectly composed. She took another step forward, placing herself between her brother and the three men who threatened him. "I'm going to give you one chance," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "to apologize to my brother and leave this establishment like civilized human beings." Morrison burst into laughter, slapping his knee as if he'd just heard the funniest joke of his life. "You hear that, boys? This little filly thinks she's going to tell us what to do." He looked around the room again, seeking support from the other patrons. Maybe she needs to learn the same lesson as her crippled brother about showing respect to their betters. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in Clearwater, Texas, though the various witnesses would tell slightly different versions of the story for years to come. Beth Wellington, all 5 feet and 4 inches of her, smiled at Jake Morrison with the kind of expression that should have served as a warning to any man with an ounce of sense. Then she reached into the folds of her riding dress and produced a Colt .45 revolver that looked far too large for her delicate hands, but which she held with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. The saloon fell into absolute silence. The silence that followed Beth's appearance with the Colt .45 stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Morrison's cocky grin vanished, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Snake Eyes and Tommy shifted nervously, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons before stopping as they realized the futility. "Now," Beth said, her voice calm, "I believe I mentioned something about an apology." Sam stared at his sister in amazement. He'd known Beth was spirited, but he'd never imagined she would put herself in such danger on his behalf. The Colt in her hands wasn't just for show. She could put 6 shots into a playing card at 30 paces. "Listen here, miss," Morrison said, trying to regain his bravado. "You don't want to be pointing that iron at decent folks like us." Beth's green eyes narrowed. "The only indecent folk I see are 3 cowards who thought it amusing to mock a man for something beyond his control." "You got some fire," Snake Eyes spoke for the first time, his scarred face twisting into a smile. "But little girls who play with guns sometimes find out they're not as tough as they think." "Perhaps," Beth replied smoothly, "but we'll discover who's tougher when you try to reach for that knife." The Mexican's hand had been creeping toward his weapon but froze as Beth made it clear she'd been watching his every movement. "Ma'am," said a gravelly voice from the back, "might I suggest these gentlemen take their business elsewhere?" Marshal Tom Brady had entered through the rear door, his hand resting on his revolver. The aging lawman's weathered face spoke of decades keeping peace in frontier towns. Morrison's eyes darted between Beth's gun and the marshal, calculating options. "Marshal, we were just having a friendly conversation. Nothing concerning the law." "Funny," Brady replied dryly, "because what I witnessed looked like 3 men terrorizing a fellow for their amusement." "Beth, please put the gun away," Sam said. "This isn't worth anyone getting hurt." "I disagree, brother," she replied without looking at him. "I think it's worth ensuring these gentlemen understand there are consequences for their actions." Morrison took a cautious step backward, hands partially raised. "Look, miss, maybe we got carried away. No harm done, right? We'll just be moving along." "No harm done?" Beth's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You publicly humiliated my brother, threatened violence, and called him names no human being should endure." Snake Eyes studied Beth with predatory calculation. "You're mighty brave with that gun, senorita, but guns run out of bullets and there's only one of you." Beth's response surprised everyone. She laughed. It was genuine, delighted laughter that echoed through the saloon, somehow more unsettling than the previous tension. "One of me?" she said, eyes sparkling with dangerous mirth. "Oh, gentlemen, you have no idea who you're dealing with." As if her words were a signal, the sound of approaching horses began filtering through the walls. At first distant thunder, but within moments it grew to an unmistakable rumble that shook the building's foundations. Morrison's face went pale as dozens of hoofbeats approached the Silver Dollar Saloon. Tommy's giggling stopped entirely, replaced by dawning terror. Even Snake Eyes appeared unsettled. "Beth," Sam whispered, understanding flooding through him. "What did you do?" His sister's smile was radiant. "I sent word to Father before entering town, dear brother. I told him some men were causing trouble for a Wellington." The color drained from Sam's face as the full implications hit him. Outside, the thunder of hooves had become deafening, and through the saloon's grimy windows, shadows of mounted riders could be seen surrounding the building. Morrison stumbled backward, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Wellington? You mean, you're one of those Wellingtons?" "Indeed," Beth said sweetly. "Samuel here is the eldest son of Marcus Wellington, owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties. And I'm afraid Father doesn't take kindly to anyone mistreating his children." The front doors of the Silver Dollar exploded inward, as 50 heavily armed cowboys poured into the saloon like an unstoppable flood. They wore the distinctive leather vests of the Wellington Ranch, each man battle-tested and utterly loyal to their employer. At their head strode Marcus Wellington himself, a towering man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter storms. "Which of you," Marcus Wellington said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, "thought it wise to threaten my son?" The saloon had become a tableau of frozen terror. Morrison, Snake Eyes, and Tommy found themselves surrounded by more firepower than they'd ever seen in their lives, with no possible avenue of escape. But as the dust settled and the Wellington patriarch's gaze fell upon his children, something unexpected flickered across his weathered features. His eyes moved from Beth to Sam, and for just a moment an expression of profound sadness replaced the righteous anger. "Father," Sam said quietly, stepping forward despite his cane, "there's no need for this. These men were just leaving." Marcus Wellington studied his son's face with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "Were they now?" he said slowly. "And tell me, Samuel, what exactly did these men say to you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and in that moment, both Sam and Beth realized that their father's arrival might reveal secrets that had been carefully buried for 22 years. Marcus Wellington's piercing gaze never left his son's face as he waited for an answer. The 50 cowboys remained motionless, their hands resting on their weapons, creating a wall of intimidation that made Morrison and his companions look like cornered rabbits. "They called me names, Father," Sam said quietly, his knuckles white against his cane. "Nothing I haven't heard before." "What names?" Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Sam hesitated, glancing at Beth, who still held her revolver trained on the 3 men. "They called me Cripple, and other things." A muscle twitched in Marcus Wellington's jaw. He stepped closer to Morrison, who had begun trembling visibly. "You mocked my boy's leg?" "We didn't mean nothing by it, Mr. Wellington," Morrison stammered. "We were just having some drinks and you thought it appropriate to humiliate a young man for something beyond his control?" Marcus's voice remained dangerously quiet. But then, something unexpected happened. Marcus's gaze shifted to Snake Eyes Rodriguez, and his entire demeanor changed. The color drained from the rancher's face as if he'd seen a ghost. "Esteban," Marcus whispered, using a name that made the scarred Mexican's eyes widen in shock. "Hello, Marcus," Snake Eyes replied, his voice carrying a weight of history that made the air in the saloon feel heavy as lead. Sam looked between his father and the man who had been threatening him, confusion evident on his face. Beth lowered her gun slightly, sensing that something far more significant than a simple bar fight was unfolding. "You two know each other?" Marshal Brady asked, his lawman's instincts picking up on the sudden shift in atmosphere. Marcus Wellington was staring at Snake Eyes Esteban with an expression of profound pain. "We knew each other a long time ago, before I was married." Before you stole my woman and destroyed my life?" Esteban finished, his scarred face twisting with old bitterness. A gasp escaped Beth's lips as understanding began to dawn. Sam felt the world shifting beneath his feet, though he couldn't yet grasp why. "That's not how it happened, and you know it," Marcus said, his voice heavy with regret. "Isabella made her choice." "Isabella?" Sam repeated, the name striking him like a physical blow. Isabella had been his mother's name, the woman who had died giving birth to him 22 years ago. Esteban's laugh was bitter as desert wind. Yes, Samuel, your precious mother Isabella, the woman who was promised to me before your father's money and power seduced her away. That's enough, Marcus growled. But Esteban wasn't finished. Did you never wonder, boy, why your leg was weak? Why you were born different from other children? Esteban's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. It's because your mother spent her pregnancy in misery, torn between two men, stressed and heartbroken over the choice she made. You're lying, Sam said, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus Wellington looked as though he'd aged 10 years in the span of minutes. Isabella was conflicted during her pregnancy. The doctor said stress could have contributed to your condition, but nothing, Esteban snarled. She loved me first, Marcus. We were to be married until you came along with your ranch and your promises. She chose security over love, and look what it cost her and her son. Beth stepped forward, her face pale but determined. That's not the whole truth, is it, Father? Marcus's shoulders sagged under the weight of secrets too long buried. No, daughter, it isn't. The saloon had become completely silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant whisper of wind through the broken doors. Morrison and Tommy seemed forgotten as a family drama decades in the making played out before the assembled crowd. Tell them, Marcus, Esteban demanded. Tell them why Isabella really chose you. Tell them about the child. What child? Sam asked, though something deep in his heart already knew the answer would shatter everything he'd believed about his life. Marcus Wellington closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were filled with tears. Isabella was pregnant when she chose between us, son. But not with you. The revelation hit Sam like a physical blow. Beth gasped and reached for her brother's arm to steady him. She was carrying Esteban's child. Marcus continued, his voice barely audible. A daughter. Isabella came to me for help because Esteban had disappeared on one of his cattle drives, and she was alone and scared. I didn't disappear, Esteban roared. I was arrested on false charges I later learned you had arranged. I wanted to protect her, Marcus said desperately. You were running with rustlers even then, Esteban. You thought you could steal my woman and my child. Esteban's hand moved toward his knife, but the Wellington Cowboys shifted ominously, their weapons appearing in their hands as if by magic. Beth's voice cut through the tension like a blade. What happened to the baby? The daughter? Marcus Wellington looked at his daughter with eyes full of anguish. She didn't die in childbirth like I told everyone. Isabella survived having her. But the birth was difficult, and the doctor said she might not be able to have more children. Might not? Sam echoed. It was 2 years before Isabella conceived again. Conceived you, Samuel, and this time? Marcus's voice broke. This time the birth did kill her. The implications of his father's words were staggering. Sam stared at the man he'd called father his entire life, understanding beginning to dawn like a terrible sunrise. The daughter, Beth whispered. Where is she now? Esteban's scarred face split into a grin that was equal parts triumph and grief. Standing right next to you, girl. Isabella's first child, my daughter, is you. The world seemed to stop turning. Beth staggered backward, her revolver falling from numb fingers to clatter on the wooden floor. Sam reached for her, his own legs nearly giving way as the truth crashed over them both. No, Beth breathed. That's impossible. I'm a Wellington, You're my daughter, Esteban said, his voice suddenly gentle. Isabella gave birth to you, then married Marcus and raised you as his own. But you're my blood, mija, my little girl. Beth turned to Marcus, her eyes pleading for him to deny it, to tell her it was all lies. But the old rancher's face told her everything she needed to know. I loved you as my own from the moment you were born, Marcus said quietly. Isabella and we never told anyone the truth. We wanted to protect you from exactly this kind of pain. Protect her? Esteban laughed bitterly. You stole 20 years of my daughter's life from me. 20 years when she didn't even know who her real father was. Sam felt as though his entire world was crumbling. The woman he'd thought was his sister was actually his half-sister, the daughter of the man who had just been mocking his disability. The irony was so cruel it took his breath away. But as he looked at Beth, beautiful, fierce Beth who had just risked her life to defend him, he realized something that made his heart race for entirely different reasons than fear. If Beth wasn't his sister by blood, then the feelings he'd been fighting for years, The love he'd forced himself to bury because it was wrong and impossible might not be as forbidden as he'd believed. And judging by the way Beth was looking at him now, with dawning understanding and something that looked like hope in her green eyes, she might have been fighting the same impossible feelings. The truth was finally out, but it was only the beginning of a story that would change all their lives forever. The silence in the $silver saloon stretched like eternity as the weight of revelation settled over everyone present. Beth stared at Esteban with wide eyes, seeing for the first time the features she'd inherited, the shape of her nose, the curve of her mouth, even the way she held her head when angry. Sam's mind raced as he processed what this meant. Beth wasn't his sister. The love he'd buried for years, the feelings he'd told himself were wrong and sinful, suddenly blazed to life with the force of a prairie fire. 22 years, Esteban said, his voice cracking with emotion as he looked at his daughter. 22 years I've wondered what happened to you. I thought you were dead. I might as well have been, Beth whispered, if you're truly my father. Marcus Wellington stepped forward, his weathered hands trembling. Beth, please understand. Your mother made me promise to raise you as my own. She wanted you to have legitimacy, security. She wanted me to have lies, Beth said, her voice growing stronger with each word. A whole life built on deception. Morrison and Tommy had been backing slowly toward the door during the family drama, but Snake Eyes, Esteban, seemed to have forgotten all about them. His attention was completely focused on the daughter he'd never known. Isabella wrote me letters, Esteban said quietly. After she married Marcus, she told me about you, how you were growing, what you looked like. But then the letters stopped coming. Because she died, Sam said, understanding flooding through him. When I was born. And Marcus destroyed her letters to prevent me from ever finding you, Esteban continued, his eyes never leaving Beth's face. I've spent 20 years looking for you, mija. 20 years of becoming someone I never wanted to be. Beth glanced around the room at the 50 armed cowboys, at Morrison cowering near the door, at Sam standing with his cane and looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Is that supposed to excuse what you just did to Sam? She asked her biological father. You mocked and threatened an innocent man. Esteban's face flushed with shame. I didn't know who he was. If I had known he was Isabella's son. It shouldn't matter whose son he is, Beth interrupted fiercely. What you did was cruel and wrong, regardless of his parentage. Sam felt his heart swell with admiration for this woman who had just learned her entire life was a lie, but still stood up for what was right. He took a step toward her, his cane tapping on the wooden floor. Beth, he said softly, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him fully. The moment their eyes met, the air between them seemed to crackle with electricity. Without the barrier of believed kinship, the attraction that had always simmered beneath the surface blazed into the open. Sam, she whispered, and in that single word was years of suppressed longing. Marcus Wellington watched the exchange between the two young people he'd raised, and understanding dawned on his weathered features. My God, he breathed. You love each other. We thought we were brother and sister, Sam said, never taking his eyes off Beth. We thought these feelings were wrong, sinful. But now, Beth stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his face gently. Now we're free to love each other the way we always have, Sam finished, his voice rough with emotion. Esteban watched this reunion with growing understanding. You raised my daughter to love your son, he said to Marcus, wonder in his voice. After everything between us, fate brought our children together. It seems Isabella's legacy isn't just pain and secrets, Marcus replied quietly. Perhaps some good can come from all this heartbreak. Marshal Brady, who had been watching the proceedings with the patience of a man used to complicated situations, finally spoke up. That's all well and good, folks, but what about these three who started this whole mess? Everyone turned to look at Morrison and Tommy, who were still trying to edge toward the door. Snake Eyes Esteban was no longer with them, having stepped away to be closer to his newly found daughter. Please, Mr. Wellington, Morrison begged. We didn't know who your son was. We'll leave town, never come back. Marcus looked at Sam, then at Beth, then at Esteban. What do you think we should do with them? Sam straightened, leaning on his cane but standing proud. I think they should apologize properly for their behavior, not because of who my family is, but because what they did was wrong. And then? Beth asked, her hand finding Sam's free one and intertwining their fingers. Then they should leave Clearwater and think seriously about the kind of men they want to be. Sam continued. Everyone deserves a chance to change. Morrison fell to his knees, Tommy beside him. We're sorry, Morrison said, tears streaming down his face. Truly sorry for what we said and did. It was cruel and stupid, and we'll be better men. Esteban studied the two groveling figures, then looked at his daughter and the man she loved. You have generous hearts, he said. More generous than I deserve. What about you? Beth asked her biological father. What will you do now? Esteban was quiet for a long moment, his scarred face reflecting decades of pain and poor choices. I've been running from my grief for 20 years, becoming someone your mother would be ashamed of. Maybe it's time I stopped running. The ranch could use another good hand, Marcus said quietly. If you're willing to work honestly. You'd offer me a job? After everything? For Isabella's memory, Marcus replied. And for Beth's sake. A daughter should know her father. Sam squeezed Beth's hand, feeling complete for the first time in his life. There's something else, he said, looking around the room at the assembled crowd. I want everyone to know that I love this woman, and if she'll have me, I intend to marry her. Beth's face lit up with pure joy. Samuel Wellington, are you proposing to me in a saloon in front of 50 cowboys and a U.S. Marshal? I am, Sam said, grinning despite everything they'd been through. Though I'll do it properly later with a ring and flowers. Yes, Beth said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The saloon erupted in cheers from the Wellington Cowboys, who began firing their guns into the air in celebration. Marshal Brady shook his head but couldn't suppress a smile at the unexpected turn of events. As the celebration continued around them, Sam and Beth held each other close, finally free to express the love they'd kept hidden for so long. Outside, the sun was setting over Clearwater, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It had been a day of revelations and confrontations, of secrets revealed and hearts set free. Morrison and Tommy slipped out of the saloon and rode hard out of town, presumably to begin the process of becoming better men. The story would follow them for years, a reminder that kindness and courage could triumph over cruelty and cowardice. Esteban Rodriguez put away his knife forever that day and took a job as foreman on the Wellington Ranch. He would spend the rest of his life making up for lost time with his daughter and finding peace with the choices that had shaped his past. And Sam and Beth Wellington were married 3 months later in the Clearwater Church, surrounded by friends, family, and 50 loyal cowboys who would tell the story of how love conquered all for generations to come. The mockery that had begun that evening in the Silver Dollar Saloon had indeed been shut down by 50 cowboys riding in. But the real victory wasn't about vengeance or family honor. It was about the triumph of love over prejudice, truth over deception, and the power of forgiveness to heal even the deepest wounds. In the end, they had all learned that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the most beautiful ones, if we have the courage to embrace the truth and follow our hearts. What did you think of Sam and Beth's incredible journey from forbidden love to true freedom? Have you ever experienced a moment when a shocking revelation completely changed your understanding of your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below about this tale of courage, family secrets, and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. If this story of justice and unexpected romance touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more authentic Western tales that celebrate the triumph of the human spirit. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to life, and we'd love to hear which moment impacted you the most: the confrontation in the saloon, the family revelations, or the beautiful love story that emerged from the chaos. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest adventures from the American frontier.